Welcome back to the Kudlow Report. I'm Michelle Caruso-Cabrera in for Larry Kudlow. In this half hour, call it the government gone wild. Wherever you look these days, seems like Uncle Sam is getting very involved in the free markets. The headline today, the effort to break up the U.S. Airways American Airlines merger, but that's just the latest example. We're going to lay it all out for you. And also, state of the art doesn't even begin to tell the story of this place. Look at this new facility for the University of Oregon football team. Are we sure we still want to call college football an amateur sport? We're going to take you inside the palace that Phil Knight built. That's a little later this hour. President Obama took questions about the failing implementation of the Affordable Care Act last week in his press conference. Did he really answer any questions? Take a listen and decide.
I want to ask you about two important dates that are coming up. October 1st, you got to implement your signature health care law. You recently decided on your own to delay a key part of that. And I wonder, if you pick and choose what parts of the law to implement, couldn't your successor down the road pick and choose whether they'll implement your law and keep it in place?
We're not in a normal atmosphere around here when it comes to quote-unquote Obamacare. We did have the executive authority to do so, and we did so. But this doesn't go to the core of implementation.
Now, the New York Times reports the administration has delayed yet another part of Obamacare, the limit on out-of-pocket costs for patients. Is this just more evidence that the entire health law should be delayed or even repealed? Here now is former Obama Deputy White House Press Secretary Bill Burton, now Vice President and Managing Director of Global Strategy Group, and also Hadley Heath, Senior Policy Analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. This is the third part of Obamacare that's getting delayed or not implemented at all, Hadley. It grows increasingly apparent that it's just incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to implement.
Exactly. The news with Obamacare is this: a new day, a new delay. This is an admission, or should be, to the American people that this law is unworkable. This is on the heels of the White House providing a special kind of waiver for members of Congress and their staff. If it's not good enough for them, it's certainly not good enough for us. And this means we need to delay the entire law or repeal it.
Bill, what do you think? A lot of this had to do with basically software. When you have to bring together all of these companies nationally, trying to figure out who's met their out-of-pocket costs, it's become incredibly difficult. Small companies have trouble with their IT and their software. Imagine the national government trying to do this.
Well, Michelle, as you point out, this is a big deal. And when you're implementing a big law, sometimes there are things that are going to be particularly complicated. When I was at the White House and healthcare was being put together, folks knew that this was going to be a very complicated thing. And so what the president was addressing in that press conference, where he talked about the one delay, you would think that the business community would be happy that he is listening to the business community and heard some of the complications that they were having. And so to make what is a big law more manageable, did delay one piece of it. That report in the New York Times today was a little misleading in the sense that they're talking about something that had been posted since February that people knew was coming. And secondly, you know, a lot of these consumer protections that are going to bring costs down for folks are already in place or will be implemented next year, like not being able to be denied for pre-existing condition. Things like capping out-of-pocket costs, banning lifetime caps on health insurance. So consumers are already experiencing a lot of the benefits of health care reform, and they will even more.
The cap on out-of-pocket costs is what's being delayed at this point. That's not going into effect. That's the whole point.
That's one piece of it. And yes, the piece of it will take time to implement. And there are complications with the software, as you say, and listening to business and allowing for the fact that it's going to be hard to put in place.
There are complications with the software, as you say. You say that almost in a banal way. I mean, this is a massive program that is going to be nearly impossible. I mean, did you install Microsoft, the most recent version of Windows? I mean, it is just an enormous issue dealing with software.
No,
and we're asking the federal government to get it right across the entire population.
And I tell you, this isn't just... Hold on one second, Hadley. Let me just respond to that. This isn't just about the software inside the federal government. These are the individual businesses and providers who have to change up their systems as well. And I assure you they have the latest version of Windows.
Right, but it's emblematic of just how difficult this is going to be, if not impossible. Hadley?
I totally agree with you, Michelle. This software is not just something that if we have some kind of virus, we lose some files on our computers. This has to do with our personal health care data and where our providers, our health insurance companies are using it, or when the government's using it in these state-based exchanges. We've got to have a system in place to verify data on people's incomes, their health insurance status, real-time data, and we're simply not ready. The programs are not ready. If anything, I would hope that Republicans and Democrats could agree that this law needs to be delayed, that we need to take our time with implementation, because no one wants to be a part of that train wreck, Republicans or Democrats.
Well,
and as Bill says,
the president, Hadley, the president's not asking Congress to do that. He's just doing it himself. What did you think of his response to the question about selective implementation?
Well, I think that Bill is right that the Obama White House is listening to business, but they're not listening to individuals. They're not listening to the many numbers of Americans who now say that they disapprove of Obamacare, that they don't want any part of it. So if the White House is willing to listen to business, they ought to listen to individuals. But
you approve of his picking and choosing parts of the law?
No, absolutely not. We know that in this country, Congress is supposed to write the law. If you want to have a delay of a significant provision of the law, like the employer mandate or like the individual mandate, as the House has passed legislation to do, then you need to do that through Congress. We have a legislative process to do these things rather than through administrative fiat.
I do agree with Hadley that Congress ought to be in the business of writing laws, but the Republican House has made clear that they have no intention of doing any such thing anytime soon. Let me just make one point about what Hadley said about listening to individuals. And if you look
Hold on, no, finish your thought about why is it okay for the president to selectively pick and choose what part of this bill, what part of this law will be enforced or won't be?
Well, what the president is doing is implementing what is a very complex change to the way that our nation treats health care in order to curb the rising costs of health insurance for all Americans.
So that justifies circumventing law.
Well, I would hope that we would expect of our leaders that they take prudent steps to balance the concerns of business and the need to aggressively move forward to bring down the cost of health care.
The president just charged ahead.
The president just charged ahead and didn't listen to anyone on how he was implementing this law. That probably wouldn't make a lot of sense. But as the rubber hits the road, what we have to do is balance out those needs and make sure that health care can be as effective as humanly possible. We can get costs down as quick as we can. But the Republican talking point on this, which is just let's stop Obamacare, let's defund Obamacare, that is not an answer. That's a political talking point. What the American people need is an actual plan to bring down the cost of health care. And that's what they've got.
There are many different strategies to push back against Obamacare, and that's what people who support a free market are doing, because we care about the quality of health care in our country, because we care about the choices available to Americans and their families. This is not necessarily a political football. This has to do with our concern for our health care system and for our fellow Americans.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks,
Have you back again. All right, Bill.
Thank you.
Oh, they're coming back. They're not moving. They're going to be back with us in just a minute, because now the government is busier than ever getting involved in everything from Bitcoin to also airline mergers. Is this just the way it is in America now? What's it going to take for Washington to stand down just once, please? That's next. Tonight, we have several examples of the government involving itself in almost everything. First, the proponents of Bitcoin pride themselves on operating without any central authority, but the Senate has something to say about that. Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee has reached out to several agencies about the virtual currency. They want a virtual currency policy. We continue now with former Obama Deputy White House Press Secretary Bill Burton and Independent Women's Forum Senior Policy Analyst Hadley Heath. Bill, what do you think of this? You know, we have Bart Chilton on from the CFTC, and he admittedly wants to basically regulate anything with a pulse. And even he said he wasn't that interested in regulating Bitcoin, and yet the Senate wants something done here. What's going on?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First, if you look at the folks in the Senate who are looking to ask more questions about this, they include Tom Carper, a Democrat, and Tom Coburn, a Republican. And not just a Republican, someone who not a lot of people think is into government overreach. Bitcoin is a new phenomenon, and we're at the stage of it where it could be anything from the next huge new thing to just the same old thing that it's been, this small, confined currency. But when people get together and decide to put together a currency, it seems like something that the government ought to at least take a look at, especially if it's a platform or a vehicle by which people can launder money and move around funds in ways that the government probably ought to keep an eye on.
Hadley?
I understand that our congressmen, just like other Americans, probably want to understand a new market and a new innovation, and I've got no problem with them trying to understand what's happening here. But I also understand that the federal government impulse is to regulate everything with a pulse, and regulation should focus on preventing criminal activity, preventing fraud, protecting consumers, but going beyond that to micromanaging every aspect of a business is not helpful for us, and it's not helpful for new innovations.
I agree with Hadley.
Moving on, the ink is barely dry on North Carolina's new voter ID law. 2 lawsuits, though, have already been filed against the Tar Heel state. The Justice Department already fighting a similar law in Texas. Will Eric Holder challenge North Carolina as well? Hadley, what do you think of this law?
I am a proud North Carolinian, very proud to be from the old North State. I understand absolutely the hang-ups that people have with these election laws. I understand voter ID laws are controversial, but what's happening in North Carolina is mainly bringing these election laws at the state level in line with where the majority of states are.
It requires you have to have a photo ID to vote.
That's right. They'll become the 34th state to have that requirement. And while I understand the criticisms with that kind of policy at the state level, I'm also, if you feel disenfranchised having to bring your driver's license to a polling place, think of how disenfranchised people are when others cast a ballot 5 or 6 times. So I recognize that voter fraud is a significant problem.
Why are you laughing, Bill?
We have to have,
because it's hilarious.
What's hilarious?
There are no cases of voter fraud that have been stopped as a result of these laws.
How
and
do you know?
when people drill, because there's been deep dive investigations into this. And when people have drilled down and investigated, and this is, look it up on the Googles and on the internet, you'll find that there have been efforts.
You shouldn't need a photo ID to vote.
Let me just finish this point. These laws try to fix a problem that does not exist. And the reason that they are trying to put them in place is not to stop people from voting 5 or 6 times, which there are no instances of people finding folks doing. It's instead a systematic effort to stop certain groups of people from voting.
Like who?
Like African Americans, like Hispanics, like young people.
They don't have a photo ID?
I'm saying that when you look at who this affects, and this isn't just what I think.
Why would minorities be afraid to vote because they have to bring an ID?
It's not about being afraid to vote. It's just that
to have an ID is what prevents you.
Go to the Brennan
Center.
Center. I encourage your viewers to go to the Brennan Center website because they have very clear statistics that show that when you put these laws in place, it disproportionately affects people who have lower instances of having photo IDs or having driver's licenses.
Why?
Because they have lower instances of having the actual identification to go and vote.
Look, this is why I'm so frustrated with the politics of voter ID. You've got Republicans on one hand who see voter ID as the only solution. I don't really like that solution, but I don't hear any solutions being suggested from people on the left because they deny that voter fraud is a problem. We have 1.8 million dead voters registered. We have 2.8 million voters actively registered in more than one state. How can you deny that this is a problem? We have to safeguard our most sacred right to vote.
All right,
if somebody dies and still happens to be on the voter rolls, that doesn't mean that voter fraud is occurring. It just means that they died, and so they don't show up and vote. If there were instances of actually showing that this existed, that'd be one thing.
The Justice Department will not prosecute the London whale. Former J.P. Morgan trader Bruno Ixel is cooperating with investigators as they move closer to filing criminal charges against 2 of his former colleagues. That's hardly J.P. Morgan's only problem, though. The bank faces 2 other DOJ investigations, multiple other lawsuits. Is the government overreaching when it comes to J.P. Morgan or just doing its job? Hadley.
This is, again, another case where, like any kind of crisis, there's that temptation to overcorrect. We did have a huge financial crisis, the London whale, again, something nobody wants to see. Any kind of crisis, these regulators act like teenage drivers and overcorrect into head-on traffic. So we shouldn't be looking at clamping down necessarily on our financial markets just because we're fearful of another crisis. We do need regulation, but again, we need it to punish and prevent criminal activity.
Bill, I see something even more sinister here. Jamie Dimon was very upfront about his criticisms of new laws, about the government overreach, et cetera, et cetera. He was one of the few CEOs to stand up and say, enough is enough, and I see this as punishment by regulators.
No, I think if that was the standard by which the government was deciding who ought to be investigated and who ought to be looked at,
then the IRS wouldn't be doing what they're doing either, right?
Then you would see a lot. Then you would see a lot more people on Wall Street being investigated for different things. I mean, look, what happened in the financial crisis brought our economy to its knees. Yes, some of this stuff ought to be investigated. Yes, we ought to do a deep dive into making sure that consumers are protected and that people on Main Street are as protected as the folks on Wall Street. JP Morgan can lose $6 billion and just write it off and not think about it, and Jamie Dimon still gets to head up the company and the board. But for the consumers who are losing money in transactions like that, it's a big deal to them.
No,
now, Michelle, last thing I'll say, though, is that I feel like...
Let's be clear. Consumers did not lose any money in that transaction. The bank lost money. The shareholder had, as a result, fewer profits, but no consumers lost any money as a result of that transaction. All right, finally, BP is fighting the EPA. The oil giant is suspended from getting new federal contracts because of the Gulf oil spill, but it's suing to get that suspension lifted, saying the EPA is abusing its power. Hadley, what do you say to this? Have they already paid their dues with the money and the fines and everything else?
This is exactly the same as the JP Morgan story. We did have a crisis, we had a disaster, we had an oil spill, and now we're overcorrecting.
Bill?
I don't think you can say overcorrecting for what was a generational type environmental disaster that was that came about because of what BP did. And in the cleanup, they were not great partners in how we went about making sure that all of the damage was mitigated in the best possible way. So, look, I think that the EPA makes decisions based on science, based on facts, and I don't think that they're letting, the nervousness of overcorrection get in the way of what is the best possible policy for the American people and our interests.
Bill, great to have you. Thank you so much. Hadley, you too. Bill Burton and Hadley Heath joining us tonight for this lightning round on Government Gone Wild. Now, it's nice when your college football team's biggest fan